She came to the academy like any other new recruit, carrying only a small bag and a head full of worries. The gates of the academy looked taller than mountains to her eyes, and the sight of armed guards and strict officers made her heart race. Around her were dozens of other young people, all dressed in the same plain uniforms, all walking quickly as if they already belonged here. She felt small among them, unsure if she would ever match their confidence. Her shoes made soft sounds on the stone floor as she followed the line into the great hall. The walls were covered with banners of old victories, and the faces of past heroes stared down at the fresh recruits. Everyone whispered about the trials ahead, about how only the strongest would survive the tests. She listened quietly, afraid to speak, because she had no idea what she was truly stepping into. When the first drill started, she tried to copy the others. They ran in perfect lines, raised their weapons, and shouted with discipline. She stumbled more than once, her breath uneven, her arms shaking under the weight of the training gear. The instructors shouted at her, but they shouted at everyone, so she pushed forward, determined not to be left behind. At night in the sleeping quarters, she lay awake on the hard bunk, staring at the ceiling. She heard the snores of other recruits and the quiet murmurs of those who still whispered about the next day's challenges. She thought of her home, of the life she had left behind, and wondered if she had made a mistake. She wasn't strong, she wasn't fast, and she wasn't brave like the others seemed to be. All she had was a stubborn heart that refused to give up. What she didn't know was that the academy was not watching her strength or her speed. They were watching something else, something no one had yet noticed inside her. Her fate was waiting in silence, hidden beyond the training grounds, waiting for the moment it would reveal itself. She was just another face in the crowd now, but soon the academy would learn that she was different. Soon she would be summoned for reasons even she could not understand. The morning air in the training field was heavy with dust and noise. Recruits stood in straight lines, sweat already shining on their faces as the instructors barked orders. Everyone had heard whispers about today's trial, but no one truly knew what was waiting behind the thick metal gates at the far end of the yard. When those gates finally slid open with a deep grinding sound, the entire group leaned forward, curious and nervous at the same time. From the shadows came the cubs. They were not like ordinary animals. Their bodies were strong, covered in sleek fur, their eyes bright with wild energy. Though young, they moved with a force that made the ground seem to tremble under their paws. Some recruits gasped, others tried to hide their fear behind hard expressions. The instructors ordered them to hold steady, reminding everyone that these cubs were part of the academy's special training. At first, the recruits tried to follow the commands. They raised their staffs, spread out, and attempted to form a circle around the cubs. But the cubs didn't respond the way the instructors expected. Instead of retreating or calming down, they grew restless, their growls echoing across the yard. One cub leapt forward, scattering the circle. Another roared so loudly that a few recruits dropped their weapons and backed away in panic. The instructors shouted, demanding order, but nothing worked. The cubs became more aggressive, charging at anyone who dared step too close. Dust rose in thick clouds as the recruits stumbled and scrambled, trying to defend themselves without striking too hard. Because these creatures were not enemies to be killed, they were supposed to be partners for the trials. Yet in that moment it felt impossible. She stood frozen among the chaos, her heart pounding. She watched as the others failed, as the cubs ignored every command and every attempt to control them. It was a storm of noise, growls, and shouting. For a moment she thought this must be the end of her journey, that she would be crushed under the weight of failure like so many others. She gripped her weapon tightly but didn't move. Something inside her told her to wait. The cub's eyes seemed wild, untamed, almost desperate. None of the recruits understood what was happening. But deep down, without knowing why, she felt something different. She didn't see monsters. She saw frightened young creatures that didn't trust anyone. And soon fate would prove she was the only one they could trust. The yard was in chaos. Dust filled the air as recruits stumbled over one another, trying to escape the lunges of the cubs. The instructors shouted until their voices cracked, but nothing worked. Every order was drowned out by growls and the sound of boots striking the ground in panic. No one could stop them. The cubs were wild, untamed, and far stronger than anyone had imagined. She stood there, her hands shaking around her weapon, her heart beating fast enough to make her chest ache. She wanted to run like the others, but her legs refused to move. Instead, she found herself watching one cub more closely. Its eyes were not just wild, they were scared. Beneath the growls and sharp movements, she saw confusion. Almost like the cub didn't understand why everyone was shouting at it. Something inside her whispered that it wasn't rage at all, but fear. Without thinking, she let her weapon fall to the ground. The sound of it hitting the dirt caught the attention of those nearest to her. Some gasped, others muttered in disbelief, but she didn't hear them. Slowly, she stepped forward, ignoring the instructor's warnings. The cub closest to her growled louder, lowering its body as if ready to spring. Every recruit held their breath, waiting for the strike, but she didn't stop. She raised her hand, palm open, and moved closer with steady steps. The world around her blurred. The shouting, the dust, the fear, all of it faded. She looked only at the cub. When she finally reached it, she stretched out her hand and placed it gently on its head. The change was instant. The cub froze, its growl cut short as if someone had silenced it. Its muscles relaxed under her touch, its breathing slowed, and its wild eyes softened into something almost childlike. A hush fell over the yard. Recruits stared wide-eyed, unable to believe what they were seeing. Even the instructors stood speechless. The other cubs, noticing the change, stopped their frantic movements. They watched her carefully, ears twitching, their growls fading into quiet whines. It was as if her calm had spread to all of them. The yard that had been a battlefield only moments ago was suddenly still. For the first time, silence ruled the academy grounds. She stood there with her hand resting on the cub's head, unaware that her simple action had just rewritten her place in the academy. The field was so quiet that even the wind seemed to pause. Every recruit stared at the girl with the cub resting calmly under her hand. For a few long seconds, no one moved. Then the sharp voice of an instructor broke the silence, calling her forward. The calmness in the animals looked impossible to them, and they were not ready to believe what they had just seen. The instructors ordered her to step back. Reluctantly, she pulled her hand away. The cub's ears twitched, its calmness fading the moment her touch disappeared. Within seconds, its growl returned, low and sharp, sending the recruits stumbling back again. The officers exchanged tense looks. Something unusual was happening, and they wanted answers. One of the instructors, a tall figure with a hard stare, motioned for another recruit to try. That recruit stepped forward nervously, extending a trembling hand. The cub snapped its teeth in warning, making the recruit retreat immediately. Another tried with more courage, holding his ground longer, but the cub lashed out with a paw, forcing him to jump back to safety. The field once again filled with shouts and disorder. Then the instructors turned to her. "You!" they barked, their voice cutting through the chaos. "Do it again!" Her heart raced. She hadn't planned it the first time. It had just happened. Still, she nodded, her legs shaky as she walked back to the cub. The moment she laid her hand on its head again, the growls died out, as though someone had pressed a switch. The cub lowered its body peacefully, its chest rising and falling in a steady rhythm. The other cubs also quieted, watching her closely, almost waiting for her signal. Murmurs rippled through the line of recruits. Some stared at her with awe, others with suspicion. Why her? Why only her? The instructors, usually quick with harsh commands, now stood frozen, their expressions unreadable. They tested again and again, calling different recruits to try. Each time the cubs resisted, growling or snapping. And each time, when she was called forward, they settled with just one touch. It was undeniable now. Something set her apart, but instead of celebrating, whispers of doubt spread across the field. Was it luck? Was it some hidden trick? No one could explain it, not even her. All she knew was that the cubs trusted her in a way they trusted no one else. Word about what had happened on the training field spread faster than fire on dry grass. By the next morning, recruits whispered about it in the halls, in the dining room, and even during night patrols. Some told the story with wide eyes, claiming she had tamed the cubs with nothing more than a glance. Others dismissed it as an accident or luck, but even they could not ignore the truth. They had seen it with their own eyes. The instructors did not waste time. At the next trial, when the cubs were released and once again grew restless, she was called forward immediately. Her heart pounded as she stepped into the open space, feeling the weight of dozens of eyes on her. The cubs snarled, circling like shadows with teeth and claws ready, but the moment her hand reached out, their bodies relaxed. Silence fell over the yard as order returned. From that day on, her presence became a rule, not a choice. Before every trial, before every exercise involving the cubs, her name was summoned. The recruits lined up, weapons ready, but it was always she who was asked to stand at the front. The cubs ignored the shouting of officers, ignored the commands of stronger and faster recruits, but at her touch they became calm and obedient. At first she felt pride. For once she was not invisible in the academy. She was no longer the quiet recruit who stumbled during drills or stayed silent in the dining hall. People noticed her. The instructors treated her differently, watching her carefully, their eyes filled with questions. Yet the pride soon mixed with unease. She had not asked for this role, and she did not fully understand it herself. The other recruits began to talk more openly. Some admired her, calling her gift a miracle. Others grew bitter, believing she was being favored, carried through the academy without facing the same struggles as them. Whispers followed her wherever she walked. Still, when the time came and the cubs grew wild, it was always her hand that restored peace. Day after day, the pattern repeated. Chaos, then the summons, then silence. She became part of the academy's rhythm, a figure they depended on. What had started as a strange accident was quickly turning into tradition, and deep inside, she wondered if this path was truly her own choice, or one the academy had already decided for her. The academy had always been a place of competition. Every recruit wanted to prove they were the strongest, the fastest, or the most disciplined. But ever since the cubs began to obey only her, the air inside the dormitories and training grounds had changed. She felt it each time she walked into a room. Conversations stopped for a moment, eyes shifted toward her, and then the whispers began again. Some of the recruits spoke with admiration. They believed she had been chosen for something greater, that her bond with the cubs was proof of hidden strength. They watched her with respect, sometimes even with hope, as if her presence could make their own path easier. A few quietly tried to stand closer to her during training, believing the cubs might notice them too if they stayed near. But admiration was not the only feeling she stirred. For others, the sight of her walking confidently onto the training field brought bitterness. They spent hours running, climbing, and fighting to prove themselves, yet no amount of effort earned them what she seemed to have without trying. In their eyes, her bond with the cubs was unfair. They muttered that the instructors favored her, that she was given responsibilities she hadn't earned. Some said she was carried by luck, not by skill. She felt the weight of both sides pressing on her. At night, in the silence of the sleeping quarters, she could hear her name in the whispers around her bunk. Sometimes the words were sharp, filled with jealousy. Other times they carried wonder, almost like a prayer. She never answered them. She simply lay still, staring into the dark, unsure of how to feel. The truth was, she hadn't asked for this. She didn't know why the cubs listened to her when they rejected everyone else. Each time she stepped forward, her heart raced with fear that maybe this time it wouldn't work. But every time, the cubs calmed, and the cycle of whispers grew louder. The academy was beginning to see her not as another recruit, but as something different, something set apart. And though she tried to stay the same girl who had once stumbled in drills and doubted her place, she knew deep inside that the whispers were changing her future with every passing day. The day came when she was no longer called only by instructors, but also by the scientists who worked deep inside the academy. They had been watching from the sidelines, their sharp eyes noting every detail of how the cubs changed in her presence. While the recruits trained in the yard, the scientists whispered among themselves, trading theories and scribbling notes. Finally, they summoned her to their laboratories, saying they needed answers. She followed them through long, echoing corridors that smelled of metal and old books. The room she entered was lined with strange instruments, screens filled with flickering lights, machines humming quietly, and charts pinned to every wall. The cubs were there too, pacing inside reinforced enclosures, restless until her shadow fell across them. The moment she stepped near, their growls softened and their movements slowed. The scientists leaned forward, eyes wide, as if they had just witnessed a miracle. They began asking endless questions. Did she feel fear when touching the cubs? Did she hear something others could not? Was there a rhythm to her breathing? A change in her pulse? A hidden signal in her voice? They measured her heartbeat, recorded her brain waves, even studied the movement of her hands. Each time, the results showed nothing unusual. She was simply human like all the others. And yet, when she touched the cubs, the impossible became real. The scientists grew more curious, sometimes frustrated. They brought in other recruits to mimic her actions. None succeeded. They tried scents, sounds, even special uniforms, hoping to find the secret. Still, the cubs snarled at everyone else and obeyed only her. Some scientists suggested there was a biological link, something in her blood. Others whispered that perhaps it was not science at all, but something deeper, an emotional connection no test could measure. She sat quietly during these sessions, uneasy under their watchful eyes. She was not a puzzle to be solved, yet that was how they treated her. The more they studied her, the more she longed to slip back into the shadows, to be just another recruit again. But there was no going back. The scientists had confirmed what the Academy already suspected. She was unique, and though they could not explain why, they knew she held a key no one else did. From then on, her bond with the cubs was no longer just strange. It was something the Academy began to depend on. It was during one of the quieter trials that she began to notice something strange. The cubs were restless, pacing back and forth inside their enclosure, their sharp claws scraping the floor. She had been summoned again, the instructors watching with crossed arms, the recruits standing in tense silence. She stepped forward as usual, placing her hand on one of the cubs, and just like before, it calmed. But this time she felt something different. Her own heart had been steady, her thoughts clear, and the cub's breathing slowed to match her own. It was almost as if her calmness had poured into the creature. Curious, she pulled her hand back and let her mind wander to the fear she had carried when she first arrived at the Academy. Instantly, the cub twitched, its body stiffening, its growl returning. She blinked in surprise, quickly steadying herself again. When she took a deep breath and calmed her racing thoughts, the cub softened once more. Over the next few days, she tested this quietly, without telling anyone. She learned that the cubs did not respond only to touch. They seemed to respond to her emotions. When she was nervous, they grew uneasy. When she felt doubt, their movements turned sharp and unpredictable. But when she centered herself, when she let go of fear and stood tall, they became calm, obedient, even protective. This discovery unsettled her. It was one thing to reach out with her hand, but another to realize that her very state of mind shaped their behavior. The bond was deeper than anyone around her could understand, deeper than even she had words for. It was not training or tricks, it was connection, yet this bond came with pressure. If she faltered, if her heart gave in to panic, the cubs would reflect it. She could no longer allow herself to break down in front of others, because their safety depended on her control. The weight of it pressed heavily on her shoulders. Still, in the quiet moments when no one watched, she sometimes sat near the cubs without touching them at all. They lay down beside her, their breathing slow, their eyes closing in peace. In those moments, she realized that what tied them together was not command or force, but trust. And trust, she knew, was harder to carry than any weapon. The Academy prepared the recruits for one of their biggest tests yet. The trial grounds had been set with obstacles, high walls, and narrow passages designed to test both strength and courage. The cubs, larger and stronger now than when she first saw them, were released to challenge the recruits. Instructors stood at every corner, their sharp eyes following every move. The recruits gripped their weapons tightly, sweat already dripping before the trial even began. At first, everything moved as planned. The recruits worked in teams, pushing through barriers and facing the cubs with shields and staffs. She watched from the side, waiting, as she always did, in case she was called. The cubs were fierce but manageable, their growls echoing across the yard. But then, something changed. One cub, the largest of the group, suddenly broke from the pattern. Its growls turned to furious roars, its eyes wide with something close to rage. It charged straight through a group of recruits, sending them crashing into the dirt. Weapons clattered to the ground as panic broke out. Recruits scattered in every direction, shouting for help. Even the instructors, who rarely showed fear, shouted orders that sounded more like warnings. The cub was out of control. Its claws slashed the air, tearing through training shields like they were paper. A recruit stumbled, falling directly in its path. Gasps filled the air. There was no time for rescue until she moved. Her feet carried her forward before her mind even caught up. She pushed past the frightened recruits. Her voice caught in her throat. The cub roared, its paw raised high, ready to strike. She raised her hand, not to fight, but to reach out. The moment her palm touched its head, the cub froze. Its roar died in its throat, its raised paw trembling, then lowering slowly to the ground. Its chest heaved with heavy breaths, but its eyes softened, confusion replacing fury. The recruits who had been moments from disaster stared in disbelief, their faces pale with shock. The field went silent. The fallen recruit scrambled away, alive because of her. Instructors exchanged uneasy glances, knowing the truth. Without her, someone would not have walked away from this trial. She stood there, her hand still resting on the cub, her own heart pounding so loudly she thought everyone could hear it. For the first time, she truly understood. The bond was no longer just strange or curious. It was the line between order and chaos, between life and death. After the trial where she calmed the furious cub, the academy was no longer the same for her. The story spread beyond the training grounds, beyond the whispers of recruits, and reached the highest offices. The leaders of the academy, men and women whose faces were rarely seen by ordinary trainees, summoned her. She stood in a tall chamber lined with banners and polished floors that reflected the light of burning lamps. The silence in that room carried more weight than all the shouting of instructors she had endured. They questioned her carefully, asking about every detail, what she felt, what she saw, what she thought in the moments when the cubs obeyed her. She tried to explain, but her words felt small. How could she describe something that even she didn't fully understand? Still, they listened closely, nodding in silence, their sharp eyes never leaving her. After hours of questions, their decision came. She was no longer just another recruit. She was to be considered essential. Orders were written that she must attend every major trial, not as a trainee, but as part of the academy's official staff. She was given authority to step in whenever the cubs grew restless, no matter who commanded the field. The change was overwhelming. Recruits who once stood shoulder to shoulder with her now stepped aside when she entered. Instructors, who had once shouted at her for stumbling in drills, now addressed her with caution. She was given responsibilities far greater than her rank, tasks usually reserved for seasoned officers. The academy had placed its trust in her bond with the cubs, a trust she had never asked for. At first, she felt honored. To be recognized by the leaders was something most recruits could only dream of, but with recognition came pressure. Every trial became heavier, every mistake more dangerous. She could no longer fail quietly. Her actions were tied to the safety of all those around her. The recruits looked at her differently now, some with admiration, others with jealousy that cut deeper than words. Standing in her quarters at night, she stared at her reflection, wondering if she was still just a trainee or something entirely different. The academy had changed her role, but inside she still carried the same doubts and fears. She hadn't chosen this path, yet it was now hers to walk, with the weight of the academy's expectations pressing on every step she took. Her life at the academy no longer felt like her own. Each morning, before she could even finish her meal, a messenger would arrive with the same words. "You're needed on the grounds." Every trial, every training session involving the cubs required her presence. If she was late or unable to come, the drills fell apart. Recruits stumbled, cubs grew wild, and instructors grew restless. Before long, people began saying it openly. Any failure was because she wasn't there. At first, she tried to bear it with quiet strength. She told herself it was her duty, that the academy trusted her for a reason. But the summons never stopped. Even on days when she was sick with exhaustion, her name was called. When the recruits couldn't manage the cubs on their own, eyes turned toward her as if she were the answer to every problem. The weight pressed heavier with each passing day. Whispers that once carried wonder now carried blame. If a cub injured someone, people muttered that she hadn't done enough. If a trial ended in disorder, they said she should have controlled it better. It no longer mattered that she was only one person, still a trainee at heart. To them, she had become the key to order, and when order failed, the blame rested on her shoulders. At night, she lay in her bunk, staring at the ceiling, too tired to sleep. Her body ached, but it was the pressure in her chest that hurt most. She thought about the girl she used to be, the one who stumbled in drills, the one who doubted her place. That girl had been invisible. Now she was seen by everyone, but not for who she truly was. They saw only the role she played, not the person beneath it. Sometimes she wished she could disappear just for a day and let the academy handle the cubs without her. But deep down, she knew what would happen if she wasn't there. People could get hurt, and that thought chained her to her duty, no matter how heavy it became. The academy called her gift a blessing, but in her heart, it was beginning to feel more like a cage, one she could not escape, no matter how desperately she longed for freedom. One late evening, when the training grounds had emptied and silence filled the academy, she was summoned to the research wing. The corridor smelled of sterilized metal and humming machines. She had never been allowed there before, and the seriousness on the faces of the guards made her heart beat faster. Inside, the academy's scientists waited, their eyes sharp, as though they had been watching her for far longer than she realized. They asked her questions, not about drills or discipline, but about how she felt when the cubs obeyed her. Did she hear anything unusual? Did her body react? Did she sense something others could not? Confused, she answered as honestly as she could. She told them about the calm that flowed through her when she touched the cubs, how her own heartbeat seemed to steady theirs, and how sometimes it felt less like control and more like a quiet conversation without words. At last, one of the scientists revealed the truth. The cubs were not ordinary alien creatures captured for training. They were engineered, designed with a resistance to all forms of command. No normal recruit, no trainer, no device could bend their will. They had been made this way deliberately, to test whether human discipline could overcome defiance. Yet there was one hidden flaw in their design, a rare kind of human resonance. It was something buried deep in the body, something that only appeared once in many generations. Her chest tightened as the scientist explained that she carried this resonance. It was not skill, not training, not luck. It was something in her very being, something she had never chosen. The cubs had not bowed to her because of who she was as a person, but because her body carried the one signal they could not resist. The room felt colder after the revelation. She looked down at her hands, the same hands she had thought were building trust, shaping bonds, creating something meaningful. Now she wondered if it had been real at all, or just science pulling invisible strings. The cubs' eyes, their trust, their calmness. Was it genuine affection, or only the reaction to a force within her that they had been created to obey? Walking back through the quiet halls, she carried the weight of this secret. The world saw her as special, chosen by destiny. But in her heart, she began to question if she was special at all, or simply an accident of design, caught in a plan far larger than herself. The training field buzzed with energy as cadets finished their drills, but behind the usual noise there was a sharper edge in the air. Whispers had turned into open remarks, and open remarks into pointed stares. The girl felt the shift every time she walked past. At first, it had been small, an odd look, a muttered comment, but now it was louder, harder to ignore. Some cadets began saying what others only thought. She was not truly earning her place. They claimed her victories were not her own, but gifts from the cubs. When a trial ended in order instead of chaos, the credit fell on her bond with the creatures, not her discipline or strength. To them, she wasn't a soldier, just someone lucky enough to be carried by beasts who adored her. During sparring sessions, a few recruits made their feelings obvious. They pushed harder, struck sharper, as though trying to prove she couldn't hold her own without the cubs nearby. Even in the mess hall, the quiet corner she once sat in became heavier with resentment. One cadet muttered loud enough for all to hear, "Without those creatures, she'd be nothing." Laughter followed, though it was uneasy, not joyful. Inside, the words struck deeper than she wanted to admit. Part of her feared they were right. After all, hadn't the scientists told her that the bond was not skill, not choice, but something in her body she never asked for? Was she being praised for something she didn't earn? The doubt gnawed at her, making her hesitate in drills and lose focus in her studies. Yet even through the bitterness around her, there were moments that kept her steady. Some cadets defended her quietly, pointing out that none of them had managed to face the Cubs without her. Others stayed silent, neither against nor for her, but she could feel their eyes weighing her every move, judging if she was more than just the girl the Cubs loved. The jealousy reached its peak one evening when she entered the training yard, and the Cubs rushed to her side, ignoring everyone else. A wave of murmurs swept through the group, sharper than any command. In that moment, she realized she stood in the center of a line dividing the academy. To some, she was a miracle. To others, she was a threat. And she had no choice but to carry both burdens. The tension in the academy reached a point where she could no longer bear the whispers. Every glance, every murmur reminded her of the same accusation, that she was nothing without the Cubs. It weighed on her more than the toughest drills. She knew if she didn't act, the shadow of doubt would follow her forever. So when a mission was announced, a scouting task beyond the academy walls, she stepped forward before anyone else could. Her voice was steady as she volunteered. "I'll do it alone." The room fell silent. Some smirked, certain she would fail. Others looked surprised, perhaps even hopeful. The instructors raised their brows but allowed it. After all, if she was to prove herself, this was her chance. The mission was dangerous but not impossible. A section of old ruins near the academy had been stirring with strange signals. Cadets were to investigate, map the area, and report any signs of hostile life. Usually, groups were sent together, but this time, she would face it on her own. No Cubs to protect her. No one to calm the chaos for her. Only her training, her mind, and her will. The ruins were cold and silent when she entered, the air heavy with dust. Every sound seemed louder in the emptiness, the crunch of her boots, the distant drip of water. She forced herself to remember her lessons. Check the walls, watch the shadows, trust your instincts. When movement stirred in the dark, her heart raced, but she didn't falter. Instead of panicking, she thought carefully, using her surroundings to her advantage. At one point, a pack of small but fierce alien creatures surrounded her. Without the Cubs, the academy believed she would crumble, but she didn't. She set a trap, lured them into a narrow passage, and used her wit to outsmart them rather than fight blindly. Her calm thinking turned what could have been disaster into survival. Hours later, she returned to the academy bruised, tired, but unbroken. She carried a full report, detailed maps, and proof of the creatures she had faced. The yard grew quiet as she walked in, alone but victorious. The Cubs weren't by her side, yet she had succeeded. For the first time, the whispers stopped. No one could say she was carried by loyalty alone. She had shown courage, intelligence, and strength that were fully her own. The doubts were silenced, and even those who resented her were forced to respect what she had done. By the time her training neared its end, the academy was no longer the same place she had first walked into. What began as confusion and whispers had grown into something much larger, a story that spread through every hall and every yard. No one could deny the truth anymore. The Cubs obeyed only her, and with that bond, chaos turned into calm. The academy leaders, once doubtful, saw the value of what she carried. They decided to make it part of tradition. From that day forward, before every test, the recruits would face the Cubs, not as enemies, but as a trial of discipline and trust. Yet the rule was clear. It would always be done under her guidance. She stood at the edge of every trial, her calm presence shaping the outcome. What had started as a strange accident became a cornerstone of training. The younger recruits began to look at her differently. Instead of jealousy, many now saw her as a figure of guidance. When the Cubs snarled and resisted, Her steady hand reminded them that strength was not only in weapons or orders, but in the quiet bond between living beings. She taught them that force alone could never win true loyalty, and that sometimes the bravest act was to reach out in trust rather than strike in fear. Even the cubs seemed to sense the change. They grew alongside her, no longer wild terrors in the eyes of cadets, but teachers in their own right. They tested the recruits, pushed their limits, and revealed who was steady under pressure and who broke under fear. And through it all, her bond with them remained unshaken, a living example of something beyond science or design. By graduation, her story was already being told like a legend. Cadets whispered of the girl who tamed the untamable, who stood between chaos and order with nothing but her touch. Some said she was chosen by fate. Others still whispered of secrets hidden in her blood. But in the end, what mattered was what she had proven. Her legacy became clear. Humanity's greatest strength was not just power, weapons, or commands. It was the ability to connect, to calm, and to build trust where none should exist. Long after she left the academy, her tradition remained. Before every test, the cubs stood waiting, and every recruit remembered the lesson she had carved into history. True strength begins with connection.